On January 9, 1947, a funeral mass was underway in Cádiz Cathedral. Manuel de Falla, one of Spain's greatest composers and a native son of Cádiz, was being laid to rest. It was in this magnificent church that the young Falla worshipped with his family, always attending the Good Friday service to hear Haydn's 7 Last Words of Christ. Haydn's work was commissioned by the cathedral in 1787 and performed every Good Friday thereafter. The pensive, powerful music deepened Falla's faith and kindled his nascent interest in music.
Falla was born in southern Spain, in the city of Cádiz, in 1876, and he was fortunate to grow up in a comfortable family. His father had a successful shipping business, and it was his mother who oversaw the cultural and spiritual, educational edification for the family. So young Falla, or Manolo as he was called, had piano lessons. He was also interested in literature and was encouraged to pursue literature. He got so enthusiastic that he started his own magazine. He went to the opera with his family and got very upset if they took him home before the opera was over because they felt that a child of his age should be in bed. He also participated in the yearly tradition in Cádiz of performing Haydn's 7 Last Words, which is performed every year in a portion of the Cádiz Cathedral. It depicts the events of Good Friday, and Falla was very moved by this and showed this early sensitivity to music.
From the age of 17, something of a conviction, both frightening and profound, drove me to drop everything to devote myself to the study of composition. The calling was so strong that it even made me feel afraid. I believed myself incapable of having inspiration, that mysterious force without which it is impossible to realize anything truly useful. Had it not been for my religious convictions, I would never have the courage to follow such a foreboding path.
Manuel de Falla showed great promise as a pianist. By his teens, he would be invited to perform at the music salon of Salvatore Viniegra, an amateur cellist. In Viniegra's salon, several of Falla's early compositions were first performed.
Falla's personality, for me and for many writers, and probably for his friends also, was a very complex one. In the very deep recesses of his heart and soul, he was a very, very kind man, very honorable man, a very spiritual and religious man. And these principles guided his life and his artistry as well. Everything he did in his life was guided by this inner sense of faith.
Falla was raised as a Roman Catholic, in a Roman Catholic family, in a Roman Catholic country. As a young man in Madrid, he had a spiritual confessor, a priest, Padre Fedriani, who noticed Falla's desire for perfection and sometimes suggested very strongly that Falla's sense of himself as a sinner was perhaps exaggerated. He also noticed Falla's tendency to procrastinate. At one time, Falla was in love with a young woman, actually his cousin, and Fedriani encouraged him to declare himself. He said, you know, she doesn't like mysteries the way you do. Just come out with it and say it. And Falla couldn't bring himself to do this, whether out of fear, whether out of the sense that he was aware that he wasn't perfect.
The search for perfection likely originated with Padre Fedriani's insistence that young Falla follow a strict daily regimen of prayer.
You shall devote the days of the week to the following: Sunday to the Holy Trinity, Monday to the Blessed Sacraments, Tuesday to the Holy Virgin, Wednesday to Saint Joseph, Thursday to all the angels and saints, Friday to the Lord's Passion, Saturday to the Holy Virgin. All the works of charity and religion will be dedicated in penance for your sins.
Perfectionism accounts for Falla's slow, meticulous composing, as well as daily routines for exercise and personal hygiene. Late in life, in despondent moments, Falla wrote that perhaps he could have accomplished more by pursuing a religious vocation. His lifelong work, Atlantida, unfinished at his death, was informed by deep piety. Its theme, evangelizing the New World by Spanish explorers.
When Falla turned 20, actually a little bit before then, he would commute to Madrid for piano lessons because he felt that he had pretty much exhausted what Cadiz had to offer him. By the time he was 20, though, he was living there full time, and he was studying at the conservatory where he completed the program very quickly and got along quite well with his piano teacher, who continued to influence him, a gentleman by the name of José Trago. And he also made contact eventually with one of the most important figures in Spanish musical history, Felipe Pedrell, who had come from Barcelona to teach in Madrid. He was a musicologist, a critic, and a composer, and it was really Pedrell who opened the eyes of many Spanish composers, not just Falla, to the rich folk tradition that was part of Spanish culture. Falla faced several challenges in Madrid, not the least of which was economic, because his father's shipping business had failed, and suddenly the whole family, his parents and his sister and his brother, suddenly all showed up to live in Madrid with him, and he was the sole supporter. And it was not a particularly inspiring teaching environment for him, so he also was wanting to cultivate his abilities as a composer. And to that end, he entered a contest sponsored by the Madrid Conservatory, in which applicants were expected to write a virtuosic piano work, an allegro de concierto. And Falla won honorable mention with his, but a call went out from the Academia de San Fernando, one of the main intellectual bodies in Madrid, for a composition contest, and entrants could write in a couple of different genres, but the one that caught Falla's eye was writing a one-act opera in Spanish. The name of the opera is La Vida Breve, which we might translate as The Short Life or Life is Short, and it, of course, refers to this young girl who gives her love to this unfaithful young man and is inevitably disappointed and dies of a broken heart. Falla was embittered by the fact that his opera that had won this contest was not going to be performed at the Teatro Real. It wasn't that he had done so badly. He also won another piano competition. He played a lot of different works by many different composers and was lucky enough to win a grand piano for his efforts. But he was still teaching students who he didn't think were very promising. He still had a lot of financial burdens. And besides, there was Paris.
Manuel de Falla's arrival in Paris in the summer of 1907 was not auspicious. His contact there, the violinist Paul Koshansky, never showed up at the Quai d'Orsay as expected. Making his way to Koshansky's apartment, Falla stepped out onto the busy streets of Paris. We don't know what the composer felt hearing the cacophony of horse-drawn carriages, the automobile engines, and people rushing about, but we do know that he fell in love with the city. Paris's opera and concert halls, and its parks and public buildings surpassed in size and beauty anything Falla had seen in his native Spain. Falla did not know then that his planned short stay in Paris would extend to 7 years.
Falla arrived in July. In October, he screwed up his courage and knocked on Debussy's door, hastened to show him La Vida Breve. He allowed Debussy to give him advice on instrumentation, on orchestration, on timing, on drama, and the result was that La Vida Breve, the one-act opera that he had presented to the Academy in Madrid, was now expanded into 2 acts, and the whole thing was far more convincing dramatically as a result.
He meets Ducasse. Ducasse is very gracious. He invites Falla to play through the entire work at the piano for him, and he's very much impressed. He pledges to help Falla have the work premiered at the Opéra Comique, and over a period of several years, Ducasse and Debussy as well have a great deal of input on Falla's revisions to La Vida Breve. They influence the reorchestration of the work. Debussy in particular has suggestions about the dramatic form. And the piece is ultimately premiered in Nice sometime before Falla returns to Spain in 1914.
Falla completed the 4 Spanish pieces for solo piano while he was in Paris. He had started them back in Madrid, but when he came to Paris, he was now suddenly in the company of Albéniz, Dukas, Debussy. We haven't mentioned Ravel or Stravinsky either, all of whom he got to know in Paris, as well as many other important musicians and artists. So he was newly stimulated, had new things to say harmonically, and was far beyond the sort of romantic salon-type pieces that he had written while he was in Cadiz and Madrid.
Without Paris, I would have stayed buried in Madrid, interred and forgotten, leading a gloomy life, living miserably off a few lessons and keeping the prize, like a family memento, in a picture frame, and my opera in a drawer.
In the case of Manuel de Falla, Paris was attractive not only because of the city's status as a cultural and musical mecca and because of the great musicians who were there and the opportunities to learn, to perfect his craft as a composer. But my opinion is that he was also attracted to Paris because Isaac Albéniz was living there. Albéniz was a hero to him. Albéniz had lived there since 1894. He was well established in the city, had a lot of useful connections, knew everybody, but above and beyond that, Albéniz was demonstrating how it was possible to write, in Albéniz's words, Spanish music with a universal accent. In other words, he was writing music thoroughly grounded in Spanish folklore, but which was also thoroughly modern, thoroughly new, and clearly influenced by the example that Debussy and Ravel were setting. And that was the example that Manuel de Falla wanted to follow. That was the kind of music he wanted to write.
For me, music is an art of evocation. I wish to speak and paint with it. I am interested in the relation between color and sound, and often my melodic and harmonic combinations have been suggested by a painting or an old stained glass window.
Falla also wrote several songs while he was in Paris. One group, the 7 popular Spanish songs, are perhaps the most popular Spanish songs ever written by a classical composer.
The songs come from folkloric sources. In Spain in the 19th century, there were musicologists and people that went through the countryside gathering popular songs from each region. Manuel de Falla used and exploited flamenco themes and elements in this particular era of his writing, with Al Amor Brujo and La Vida Breve, and this very last song of the cycle called Polo. And it's really based or emulating El Canto Hondo, which is this Andalusian type of expression that one could say it's like the blues. It's kind of like singing the blues, but in Andalusian gypsy style.
Manuel de Falla's 7 years in Paris were very productive. With help from Debussy and Dukas, he found a publisher, and La Vida Breve and his songs and piano compositions won critical acclaim. But just as Falla was considering settling permanently in Paris, powerful events forced him back to Madrid. The rivalry between Republican France and autocratic Germany, smoldering since France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, burst forth again in August 1914, this time as a pan-European conflict, employing deadlier weapons and involving millions of men. World War I disrupted the lives of all foreigners living in Paris. Most chose to leave. Reluctantly, Falla returned to Madrid.
When Falla returned to Madrid, he decided to pursue his interest in the stage. And here he was fortunate to have the collaboration of Gregorio and Maria Martinez Sierra, who were important in Madrid's theatrical life. He had actually met them in Paris, and now he renewed his friendship with this unusual couple. Gregorio was the impresario, and his wife, Maria, was actually the one who wrote most of the productions that they did, even though her husband was the one who signed his name to all of their plays. By collaborating with Gregorio and Maria, Falla added two important works to his catalog of compositions. The first one was El Amor Brujo, or Love the Magician, in which he pursued his interest in flamenco music, this time by having a real gypsy, Pastora Imperio, appearing on the stage and singing the flamenco numbers.
If one thinks of ballet as the loftiest expression of Western dance, a kind of dance where the dancer seems to defy gravity, traversing large distances, leaping through the air. Flamenco dance, baile hondo, is a very concentrated, earthbound form. It seems stamped into the earth. Instead of taking advantage of wide spaces, flamenco was originally performed in little bars or little cafes on a tabletop, really. The Polish pianist Artur Rubinstein was a great champion of Spanish music. He really had his first international success playing the music of Spain, playing the music of Albéniz. He was very much fascinated with the ballet score El Amor Brujo of Manuel de Falla, and he arranged for solo piano the ritual fire dance. And this, of course, became a signature encore of Artur Rubinstein's. Audiences would scream for it.
second work was a pantomime, El Corregidor y la Molinera, The Magistrate and the Miller's Wife, which is based on a classic Spanish novel. And that work was significant because the pantomime itself is rather modest, but because Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe, and in this case one of his choreographers, got wind of the project, he decided maybe this had the potential for a full-scale ballet.
Inspired to write a ballet version of The Magistrate and the Miller's Wife, Diaghilev, Leonid Massin, Manuel de Falla, and flamenco dancer Felix Fernandez Garcia set out on a sightseeing trip of Spain in July 1919, seeking venues where flamenco was still performed. They visited many cities and villages, immersing themselves in the style and performance of flamenco. When they returned to Granada, the four men rode donkeys up the difficult hill to the Alhambra, where they wandered around the Moorish palace and the gardens of the Generalife. Massin recalls,
"We had stopped to listen to a blind man who played guitar. Falla spoke with the man and he asked him to play the melancholy melody once more. While the guitarist played again, Falla stood still with his eyes shut. He hummed it and finally wrote it down in his notebook. Later, he used it for the Sevillana in the second act of our ballet." Leonid Massin.
El Sombrero de Tres Picos was a very important collaboration between Falla and the impresario Serge Diaghilev and his Ballet Russe. The work was premiered in London in 1919, interestingly enough at the Theatre of the Alhambra, which must have had a lot of resonance for Falla. Pablo Picasso, no less, prepared the sets and designed the costumes. The Danza del Molinero, or the Miller's Dance, was actually composed in about 24 hours at the suggestion of Diaghilev as a solo number for Leonid Massin, who did the choreography and was one of the lead male dancers of the Ballet Russe. It's a very rough, masculine-sounding kind of flamenco dance known as a farruca. Nights in the Gardens of Spain is a project that had its genesis during Falla's Paris years. It was originally a work he intended as a solo piano piece, a set of nocturne that was going to be dedicated to Ricardo Viñes, the great Catalan pianist and composer who did so much to promote contemporary piano music. Through the advice of Albéniz and other composers, Falla was persuaded to create it as an orchestral piece. And the work in its final form was completed in Sitges, a little seaside resort near Barcelona, after Falla returned to Spain. It's a three-movement work, quite evocative of the French style. It recalls the orchestral writing of Ravel in his Rhapsody Espagnole, or Debussy in his Iberia for orchestra. It's not really a piano concerto. There's a solo piano part, but it's not especially virtuosic. The piano part is really integrated into the orchestral fabric, and he uses the sound of the piano to suggest the sonority of water or fountains, much the way Debussy and Ravel had done. And in other places, he uses the piano almost as a sort of guitar, and you get that sensation of strumming or rapidly repeated notes.
Manuel de Falla decided to leave Madrid in the summer of 1920 and settle in Granada. He needed peace and quiet to continue his work, and ultimately found an ideal home, a small Carmen in the shadow of the Alhambra. The home was modest, perfect for himself and his sister, Maria del Carmen. Visiting his home today offers special insights into the composer's personality, his material needs, and his aesthetic sensibilities. The doors and chairs were painted sky blue, a reminder of the composer's days on the waterfront of Cadiz. His medical cabinet tells the story of a man suffering from a variety of illnesses. The arrangement of his personal items reflected his interest in order and perfection. And everywhere his spiritual life is evident. The sketches and paintings on the Carmen's walls attest to Falla's many artistic friendships. Granada's Andalusian sun, its mountainous landscape, and the magical presence of the great Moorish palace gave the composer the inspiration that he needed to be creative and productive. Falla received the tragic news of Claude Debussy's death in 1918. As Falla wrote, the French composer who he revered was a great observer who captured the essence of Chinese and Spanish music. Falla's musical tribute, Homenage de Debussy, was first performed on guitar by Miguel Lobé at the Teatro de la Comedia in Madrid on March 8, 1921.
His friend Federico Garcia Lorca had many facets to his personality, poetic and otherwise, and many people, when they recall Lorca, remember his childlike qualities. And something that he enjoyed very much was puppet theater. And Falla also became rather entranced with the idea of working with puppets. And they put on some informal puppet plays for sort of home consumption in Granada. Falla took them very, very seriously. Even if he was writing a piece for a bunch of school children, he still brought to it all of his perfectionist qualities. And part of this was a preparation for a larger work that he was preparing. This was a work commissioned by the Princesse de Polignac, who was based in Paris. She was actually from the Singer sewing machine family and married a European, and they had a wonderful theater in their Paris apartment. And she commissioned a work called Master Peter's Puppet Show, El Retablo de Maese Pedro, which is taken from an episode in Cervantes' Don Quixote. This is a very important work for Falla because in his previous music, El Amor Brujo, El Sombrero de Tres Picos, even Nights in the Gardens of Spain with its marked French influence, he's still, in certain senses, rather conventional in his musical expression. But in Granada, first in the Retablo, the puppet play, he really begins to absorb the influence of Igor Stravinsky and a movement that was known throughout Europe as neoclassicism, in which composers looked back to the past and used forms from the 18th century, or in Falla's case, from the Spanish Renaissance, but they laced those forms with modern-sounding harmonies. And the Retablo is a very good example of Falla taking music from the era of Cervantes, even earlier in some instances, and sticking in these acerbic, sort of zingy, modern-sounding harmonies. So the Retablo is really the first piece in which he does that. It's quite a story. Don Quixote, who most listeners in the United States will know either because they've read Don Quixote or because they've seen Man of La Mancha. Don Quixote, the bumbling idealist, goes to the theater with his squire, Sancho Panza, and are treated to a puppet play, but because Don Quixote sees certain things transpiring on stage that he does not believe could ever have happened, he sees nothing wrong with interrupting from the audience and saying, no, 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 that's not right. It wasn't like that, because he's so interested in truth. Another important feature of neoclassicism, which comes to the fore in El Retablo de Maese Pedro, is an interest in using small instrumental ensembles so that the peculiar sound of each instrument can really come through. There isn't this sense of orchestral blending or these unison sonorities or orchestral, well, blending is the best word, I think, that we might find in a romantic composer such as Wagner, for example. But you can hear each instrument in its individual personality. There's also the tendency to use perhaps instruments that are not as well known, because neoclassicism inevitably looks back to the past. Consequently, in the Retablo, there's the strong presence of the harpsichord. But in the end, Don Quixote can't take it anymore. The damsel in distress in the play seems to him to be real. And he surges up out of the audience, throws around all of the characters, takes his lance and destroys the stage and decapitates all of the puppets. and the opera, Falla's work ends with Don Quixote standing among the rubble of all of this.
Master Peter's puppet show was a great success, and Falla subsequently mounted productions in Seville, Paris, and London. When composers came for advice and suggestions, he was always generous with his time, and he enjoyed collaborating with Andrés Segovia, Federico García Lorca, and Wanda Landowska. His collaboration with Lorca came to fruition in 1922.
Federico García Lorca was one of the great poets and playwrights of the 20th century. He came from the middle class in Granada, and he became a very close friend of Manuel de Falla. Both of them shared a passion for Spanish folklore, and in fact, García Lorca wrote some beautiful songs. He was also a musician and something of a composer, although certainly not as good a composer as Manuel de Falla. But they shared a passion, a mutual love for Spanish folklore, in particular flamenco, and a particular kind of flamenco, hondo flamenco, or cante hondo, which means literally the deep song, a very powerful, emotional, forceful sort of singing. And because flamenco was undergoing a sort of transformation in the early 1900s and was becoming increasingly theatrical, increasingly commercial, many people were concerned that this tradition of hondo singing might die out. And so Falla and Lorca joined forces to try to promote and preserve this great tradition of cante hondo by organizing a festival, a cante hondo festival, in 1922.
The Cante Hondo Festival was held over 2 days in Granada. Large audiences listened raptly as singers with the most authentic cante expression were judged by a select jury.
Falla so enjoyed using the harpsichord in the retablo that he decided to write a harpsichord concerto, and in this he had actually been invited to do so by the great Polish harpsichordist Wanda Landowska. It's one of the most important works for the instrument in the 20th century repertory. In the harpsichord concerto, Falla carries to an either greater degree some of the principles of neoclassicism that were part of the retablo. Certainly it's a very small ensemble. It's not really a concerto in the sense of using a big orchestra. It's a small one-and-a-part instrumental ensemble. In the first movement, he plays a little bit with classical sonata form. In the second movement, he brings in ancient Spanish chant that would have been sung by monks in a church. And in the third movement, we can hear very clearly the influence of Scarlatti, the Italian composer who lived in Spain in the 18th century, but who used many Spanish idioms in his harpsichord sonatas.
Falla was especially connected to a group of 8 composers, all based in Madrid. They came to call themselves El Grupo de los Ocho, or the Group of 8. And They met in a student residence, the Residencia de Estudiantes of Madrid. They had a great deal of contact with a number of artists in other media of that generation. And this is a generation that's often referred to as the generation of 27, the generation of 1927. And it included the filmmaker Luis Buñuel and the surrealist painter Salvador Dalí and Rafael Alberti, the poet Federico García Lorca. All these people knew the musicians. Probably the two most prominent composers of that generation were two brothers, Ernesto and Rodolfo Halfter.
My father, Ernesto Halfter, went to Granada to study with Manuel de Falla, composition, and Manuel de Falla appointed him the music director of the Orquesta Bética de Cámara de Sevilla. Falla was very much influenced by the years he lived in Paris. Paris was, as we all know, a cultural center at the time, and he insisted on my father he should go to Paris and get in contact with the Groupe des Six. But especially since he admired so much Maurice Ravel, it would be very good for his preparation, for his future career, to go to Paris and study composition with Maurice Ravel. What I remember also is that someday, at the beginning, he gave some exercises to my father, and the following day, my father went to the Carmen. He felt very happy. He was very happy because he said, "Look, I have done it, I think, just exactly how you would have done it." And Falla replied, "This is not at all what I want. I don't want a copy of myself. I want you to do it your own way."
The works that I've played by Ernesto Halfter date from 1927, coincidentally. This is a Danza della Pastora, or Dance of the Shepherdess. It's sort of a 20th century parody of the style of Domenico Scarlatti. It's a single movement keyboard sonata. The technique is very harpsichord-like. It's a two-part form. Each part gets repeated.
The Danza de Ávila de Rodolfo Halfter is also a harmonization of a Spanish folk song, La Danza de Ávila. But it employs the same kind of Scarlattian concepts that Falla also was experimenting with. It's a delightful little dance, and the harmonies are Scarlattian, and the emiola that you hear in it, of course, is very typical of some Spanish dances.
In 1936, a right-wing military coup under the leadership of General Francisco Franco started the Spanish Civil War, challenging the Republic. The war came almost immediately to Granada. The war started on July 18th of 36, and Granada, Falla's adopted city, was one of the first cities to fall to Franco. And the violence could be felt everywhere.
In July of 1936, Franco invaded Spain from his base of operations in Morocco. He received assistance from Hitler in getting his forces into Spain, and he made rapid progress in seizing large amounts of territory, especially in Andalusia. And already in August of 1936, Granada was in his control. And it was during that month that García Lorca was murdered.
One of the darkest moments of the war for Falla was surely the assassination of his close friend, the poet Federico García Lorca, who in August of 36 was apprehended and killed by Franco's troops, largely because he was a leftist, he was homosexual. Some of his plays refer to sentiments that the Franco regime certainly would have considered subversive.
Falla was shocked and appalled by the murder of his friend Lorca. And of course he did not approve of the murders and the massacres and the slaughter and the general inhumanity that were taking place all around him. On the other hand, he did not want to see Spain become like the Soviet Union, where religion was officially suppressed. So for a man of Falla's sensibilities, the only acceptable outcome was one in which the Church's position in Spanish society would remain intact.
In 1926, Falla undertook a project that was very different from many of his earlier works, especially the modernist works of the 1920s. When we consider the retablo, for example, with its modest range of instruments, the fact that it can be performed in about 50 minutes, the harpsichord concerto even more so, we can only be surprised by the fact that he decided to write a cantata. He called it a scenic cantata because he envisioned it with choreography and movement on the subject of the lost continent of Atlantis, the subtext of which was the evangelizing of the planet by the Catholic Church. His text was by the Catalan poet Jacint Verdaguer, Catalan being one of the languages that's spoken in Spain, and which Falla didn't know. Falla had to sit down and spend time every day with a grammar book and learn Catalan so that he would understand Verdaguer's text, and then decide how he was going to tell this grandiose story with the instrumental means at his disposal. And it turned out that this was a project that he would never finish. He began it in 1926 at the peak of his career, at the peak of his powers, and as we'll see when we discuss the later part of his life, it almost became a burden to him and something that was a bit of an obsession, but that he never completed.
In 1926, Manuel de Falla discovered a poem entitled L'Atlantida by the Catalan poet Jacint Verdaguer. The word Atlantida means Atlantis, and the poem itself, which is of epic dimensions, deals with the voyages of Columbus and the bringing of Christianity to the Americas. Falla was inspired then to compose a scenic cantata based on this epic poem by Verdaguer. He had never composed anything like this before, and the work grew to such dimensions that he was never able to finish it. He worked on it on and off for 20 years, but left it incomplete at his death in 1946. The job fell to Ernesto Alfter, a former student of Falla's who wrote very much in the style of Manuel de Falla, and he seemed to be the best candidate for the job.
Falla was a diminutive man. He had never enjoyed particularly robust health. Some people, or some scholars, suggest that this frail health could be even traced back to his Paris period, where he didn't have very much to eat, for example. During the war years, he had several surgical procedures, one of which involved collapsing a lung, which was a cure at that time for tuberculosis. So for someone who is already psychologically debilitated because of the war and all the violence around him, already in poor health, already a perfectionist, all of these physical ailments only contributed to his low spirits during those years. In April 1939, Franco declared victory in the Spanish Civil War, and right around this time, Falla received an invitation to go to Buenos Aires, to Argentina, and do a little bit of conducting. The idea of leaving Spain appealed to him. He had no intention of remaining in Argentina permanently, just as he had had no intention of staying so many years in Paris, but he decided that he would accept the invitation and see what Argentina was like. He and his sister, Maria del Carmen, sailed that fall, but just as they were preparing their voyage, Hitler invaded Poland, and Falla began to be very depressed about the way things were going in Europe. Having already lived through the First World War and the Spanish Civil War, the idea of another war was simply more than he could bear. They arrived in Buenos Aires. He did his conducting in Argentina's Teatro Colón, which is an acoustically perfect hall that everybody wants to conduct in. But then instead of going back to Spain, they traveled around a bit in the country. They liked to go to the Sierra de Córdoba, the mountains in Córdoba province, where the air is very pure and where Falla felt that he could have the tranquility that had eluded him in Spain during the war years. After trying a couple of residences, Falla finally found a house in Alta Gracia, also in Córdoba province, which he liked very much, and where he felt that he could work peacefully on Atlántida, which was still hanging over him. His health continued to deteriorate, and he continued to be very depressed about the condition of the world. He sends letters to some of his friends in Argentina saying, what good is this? Why am I composing? What possible good can I do in a world such as this? And finally, he dies in his sleep of heart failure. And right away, the Franco government demands that the body be sent back to Spain so that it can be buried with all due pomp for a glorious son of the homeland. Falla's Argentine friends have a different point of view, and there's a big conflict over who will have the right to Falla's remains. Finally, he did return to Spain. His sister, Maria del Carmen, accompanied the body, and he was buried at the cathedral in Cádiz with a small, simple stone marker that proclaims the glory of God, and which tourists seek out to this day.